Okay, welcome back everyone to a casual chat with Rupert August and Co. Already fucked it.
Yeah, do you want to try and get your own name right?
Nah, that can stay.
So is
All
this
right.
staying as well then?
Sorry? Yes.
Is this staying as well? Excellent.
Feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Greetings. I am Henry, as always.
I'm Kurtz.
I'm Simon Burns.
Oh, you're sounding a little bit muffled there.
I am.
Yes.
Sorry, I'll speak up a bit more. Is that better?
Yes, much better. Okay, so, as alluded to last time, for anyone who's watching these in sequence, using the term watching quite loosely, we'll be talking about aristocracy further, but in the context of what different aristocracies have existed in the past, and kind of what traits have been emphasized and sort of rewarded, and what consequence that's had to how the society developed and all that kind of thing. So we've all gone away and had a bit of a look into whatever civilization we most feel like kind of drawing on and might feel is most relevant to this example. So, who wants to go first?
No one?
I was going to say, I take it you should be going first from the stunned silence.
Seems that way.
Mhm.
Okay, so I was looking into what is most commonly associated with aristocracies, i.e. the European knights, the purest form of kind of like a martial aristocracy, which largely grew out of the requirement for highly specialized military forces as a result of the kind of huge disparity that existed between the capabilities of somebody who could afford all of the best equipment that was available at the time versus what your average person had access to. So you had a whole bunch of effectively full-time soldiers who were raised more or less from birth in order to be knights. And eventually this came to develop into much more of a all-encompassing kind of worldview rather than just being purely a soldier. And that's where we get the ideas of chivalry from. It was based on the idealized versions of knights, such as in the Song of Roland and some of the works of the Provençal troubadours, songs and such that they produced. And so that developed quite a lot over time, but effectively what's being encouraged there and selected for, I suppose, is the ability, the raw sort of martial prowess, strength, intelligence to a slightly lesser extent, but you can't exactly be a complete meathead if you want to be competent on the battlefield, especially if you're taking something of a leading role, which you were kind of expected to. So just to lay out this a little bit more, to start off with, you would be brought into this sphere pretty much from birth because it became hereditary quite quickly, and you would be given the kind of ideal basing and the sort of desire to train the kind of skills that you're going to in future. That would be by your parents until you're about 7 years old. Beyond that, you would then go and train with another family, I believe, and you would be given more of the physical preparation, and then you would effectively apprentice after that to an established knight who would teach you more of the details, like even more of the details and conduct. And then eventually you would be, hopefully, if you proved competent, knighted by that knight, because the knight themselves, or the lord, who was, the major land-holding nobility, would have the ability to knight you. And then you would be either tied to that lord, or you would go off and become bound to a different lord. And there would be some amount of competition between different lords to get the best, most experienced knights, and of course the most. But being able to maintain one of these knights, because it usually fell to, or quite often fell to, the landholder, who had to provide a lot of the equipment and some of the money and whatever to the knight in order to allow them to fight and be effective, basically. But that would also come in the form of land to support themselves. So they would be a small holder in terms of land, probably, and they would earn a certain amount of days per year to for campaigning and such. That would be owed to the lord who is their liege, who they are tied to. Theoretically, anybody could become a knight if they were to demonstrate sufficient sort of military valor in the on a battlefield, or theoretically, I think it was basically just at the discretion of the kings and the lords. So you could be, you come from the most humble upbringing and become a knight, and that would pretty much set up your family going forward. Especially if you'd done something, noteworthy enough that you had become known to a wide variety of people. But it might just as easily be the case that you perform some act of relatively great valor, but not something necessarily outstanding, but it's in full view of the king. So it's kind of to do with a certain amount of luck as well, as far as I understand it. So what outcomes? Okay, yeah. Finish that question. Sorry.
How low can you go and still be able to grant people the knighthood? Do you know?
As far as I know, it was anyone. But strictly speaking, I suppose perhaps if you are this gets into difficulties as to who would be present on the battlefield, which is usually a requirement. So I'm not sure of the extent to which serfs were actually on the battlefield. Maybe I can come back to that, and I can look that up while somebody else is kind of giving their explanation, and we'll come back to that later. But it is entirely possible that serfs would not generally be taken off the land, and therefore they would have no opportunity, and thus you had to be some kind of a freeholder, not necessarily of a basically just a high-ranking peasant, effectively, who owns their own little plot of land and thus has a little bit of autonomy, and thus they would afford the weapons to go and become a levyman and put themselves in a position where they might be noticed for their valor in combat. This kind of changed a bit over time when gunpowder, for example, started becoming more prevalent, and the amount of weapons that could act as force multipliers were proliferated on the battlefield, and it put a lot more power in the hands of the central authority, who was having to part with the expenses necessary to maintain things like cannons and large gunpowder stocks and large arsenals of weapons. So you get it back to the situation where a small group of landholders are able to, effectively rule the realm through the weight of money, monetary power that they could bring to the battlefield, and that just became a necessary component of even being able to compete. So for the duration of when knights were around, and obviously having an effect on society, I imagine it would have. So it does strike me that it put a lot of societies on a very, very much of a war footing. It oriented a lot of these cultures towards combat, and due to the way that the archetype of the knight developed, it became that there was a lot of respect generated for civil customs between equals, but that didn't necessarily apply to everyone. So knights would expect to take each other captive to then ransom and such, and they would be held in very comfortable holdings for the duration, and thus they might even act as though this is just some kind of like, oh, I'm staying with a distant compatriot or something like that. But in reality, they were being held captive. But it did elevate that level of civility between equals, and as far as I know, that's probably going to be a repeated theme in a lot of these discussions. But that didn't necessarily apply to everyone. So if you weren't titled in a particular way and you weren't a knight, then you were going to be more often than not considered on the battlefield to be something that is in between two knights who want to duel, not I guess a moral entity in that sense in themselves. So if you get captured as a regular old sort of peasant or serf, you might well just get executed, and there's really not that much you'd be able to do about it from your position. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts as to how that might have affected society? I guess other than orienting them in a war direction.
So my question then, I suppose, is when you say it orients people in a military fashion, is that just because, like, showing your valor in battle and becoming a knight, is that one of the very few, if not only, ways of having some social mobility from people that are like serfs and things like that?
For a very long time, yeah. The predominant access to wealth came through land ownership, and land ownership came through becoming a knight, by and large. The ways that start to emerge later on tend to revolve around, trading and being a merchant.
Yeah.
So those are effectively the two options. Oh, actually, no. Three options, I would say, actually, because there's also the clergy, but that's a bit more complicated, obviously. So you would join the clergy and become, educated or maybe a monk and such, and through through effective ownership of some portion of, or administration is the better term, administration of some portion of church land, you would be able to enrich yourself that way.
I thought monks were by and large not permitted to have like families and things.
No, exactly. So it's not exactly a dynastic wealth, but it's a kind of personal wealth and power that could be gathered.
I suppose.
But then in that sense, it becomes a bit more questionable as to the extent to which each person who has that power and wealth is going to want to use it in a way that we might associate with somebody who wants it. So just because they have that power and wealth, because of the ethics that are built into a monastic lifestyle, maybe they wouldn't necessarily use it in the way that a lord would.
Maybe to go back, before you tangent off about the power of the clergy all of a sudden, maybe we should go back to that question you asked.
Yep, sounds good.
Which is, what did you say, chivalry, how this order of chivalry would affect society as a whole, is what you asked, was it?
Effectively, yes. So having knights as the predominant aristocracy of the land, how does that affect culture at large, both in that moment and also going forward?
Well, obviously, as you say, it orients the entire society towards this sort of warrior military focus. But I suppose a question that I have is how necessary was it for, say, like a serf who doesn't necessarily own his own land? How necessary was it to go to war? Was it a choice, or was it could he choose to just stay at home and bang his wife?
Particularly for a serf, not particularly. It wasn't much of a choice at all. So they might be called up by their lord, and they wouldn't necessarily have that much choice in the matter, basically because they were owned by the lord.
Yeah.
And even if you were a freeman, if you were being called up, or if you were a yeoman, and you were being called up, then you were required in some cases to own weapons specifically for that purpose, for the purpose of being called up. I think it's from the 13th century onwards, possibly even a little bit earlier, that you were expected to own a sword of some kind.
I can't believe you were trying to think of things that a serf would do to occupy his time, and the first thing you came to was banging his wife.
What else is he going to do?
So is seeds.
Well, he's sowing some seed, isn't he?
All right, moving on.
I mean, if I'm going to try and answer the question, I mean, the whole point of any honor system, from what I've seen, because that's basically what the concept of chivalry is that you want people who are an exemplar, a role model to everybody else. So they will be so you kind of want to be able to point to this one group of people in your society and say, this is the ideal you should be striving towards, because it's a lot easier to give people an ideal by showing as opposed to telling.
Yeah, definitely.
So I imagine the kind of I always feel like it's a half and half thing, where it would definitely gear people towards this whole idea of militarism, along with, in the case of European knights, a lot of that chivalric code also had to do with religious ethic, if I remember rightly. So,
yeah, there was a very strong element to that. And I was just thinking how that would dovetail with the religious element, because in both cases, they're kind of, in both the case of chivalry and also in the case of Christianity, they are setting up a deliberately almost impossible standard which they ask that you adhere to. And although they give you an out as to how you can be conducting yourself sufficiently without, by falling short, there still is that overall standard which you are asked to try and achieve, even if it's almost unachievable by its nature. So that kind of orients them towards that kind of higher goal, to continually be striving towards being better.
Yeah, and so as much as you, like you said, striving to be better and everything, I do feel people would be more, humans are, let's be perfectly honest, fickle creatures, so they'd be very focused on what they see in front of them. So I can actually imagine that while lower society maybe doesn't see the worst parts of this, they're very much convinced by the whole chivalric virtue. These knights are exemplars of something greater than themselves kind of thing. I can see it being well, basically where there will be a pissing contest between knights, and I can see that being very disruptive.
Yes, there definitely would be. But the other thing that came to mind is it's worth noting that the way that all of this is set up with like local fiefs and small plots of land, relatively speaking, that knights would own, that does put the knight in a often quite direct contact with the people who live on that land, and so everybody would basically have some idea or some personal experience with a knight. It may be far above their station, but they would they would have seen their local knight probably, and I think that's quite significant compared to some of the other examples that we're going to be talking about.
More significant in that it makes them a better role model.
It makes them a more tangible role model.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just going to say I wasn't sure how important this input would be, given I think that you guys have basically already covered everything. But this idea of it is first of all going to be making your society more warlike, or at least venerate warriors in war to a sense, because your social mobility comes from your ability to impress a knight or a lord or whatever in combat, and also it does give you something it would give a freeman or a serf something to strive towards, or something that they can aspire to be at the very least. And that point about most everyone is going to interact with a knight at some point, and is just making it more tangible that they know that they can become like a knight, and being able to interact with them frequently might make it seem all that more attainable.
Truthfully, I don't know how much of a thing that would be, like how much the ideal of the knight was espoused as a meritocratic entity rather than a divinely ordained entity or something like that. But yeah, that is an interesting thought if it was the case. The other thing as well is that so going right back to the start and where this all kind of starts out, is that these knights existed because of the availability of certain kinds of weapons. That's a contentious point, you understand. But so let's say that they do exist just because of the prevalence of this kind of very expensive equipment. Not only is it expensive, but it requires a great deal of material in order to in order to be able to use this equipment, you actually have to be quite fit and strong in yourself. You have to hone your body quite a bit, which is partially why they have you train from such a young age. So from the age of about 8 up, I think, you're training your body almost continually in order to be able to use this equipment to the maximum possible extent, or the maximum possible ability, to get the most out of it. And so that, both on the genetic level, I imagine, and also in the kind of psychological level, that orients the society towards like physical improvement in terms of honing your body, which may also
especially if there is the possibility of later in life proving yourself to be worthy of becoming a knight.
Yeah, but again, I don't know how much that would have been something that people were aware of. Unless anyone's got anything else to add, I think that pretty much covers it with knights.
Mm-hmm.
No issues.
I'm happy to move on.
Okay, so let's move on to the Romans. That was you then, Kurtz. What would you like to tell us about the Roman patricians?
The Patricians of Rome. A quick preface before of what I'm going to be speaking of here. When I'm talking of the Patricians of Rome, I'm mostly speaking about the Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire, but that's just because that's when the Patricians held most power in Roman society. And I think in order to understand the Patricians, you need to understand the origin of the Patricians. They were the descendants of the Trojans who had originally founded Rome, and the patrician families some of them could be traced back to Rome's founding myth even. So the status is derived from your family being descendant from the original Trojan founding fathers of Rome. And that is what leads to the patricians becoming a social class that you can only be born into. There's no way for a plebeian to become patrician, and there's no way for a patrician to become a plebeian. The patricians, for the most part, are wealthy landowners with political power, but it's quite possible for a patrician family to lose all their land, all their wealth, all their influence but you would still be a patrician by birth. Whereas it was perfectly possible, and this did happen on occasion, where plebeians become wealthy and own land and gain power and influence, but they would never be patricians. They would always remain plebs because they don't have that all-important link to Rome's founding fathers from Troy. And there's a good few differences between the patricians and the plebs in Rome. In the early years of the Republic, there's a lot more difference between them, though, that eventually gets removed due to social reforms that end up granting the plebeians more rights. I'll get into them in a bit. Originally, only patricians could take high-ranking political positions, such as the council or dictator, whereas plebeians were confined to roles such as tribunes. Over the course of many years, however, the reforms came in, like I said, that grant the plebs the ability to take up those positions as well.
Interesting. I didn't realise that was a later addition. I assumed that plebs could always run for consulships.
No, it's something that comes in like over the course of the Republic. It's by the time the Empire comes around, it's standard fare, but in the time of the Republic, it takes a good few generations for them to eventually win. They win more and more rights as time goes on, until eventually they're essentially equal to the patricians, without the all-important birthright. Oh, and there's another point that I'm just getting onto here. The same thing applied to high-ranking religious positions, such as being Pontifex Maximus. Originally, only patricians could take that position, and other such positions that would be similar to being a high-ranking cardinal or bishop in the Catholic Church, for example. But again, this is something that over time the plebs start being able to join, essentially. There is something very interesting to note, however, and that is that it was believed that the patricians were better able to commune with Rome's gods than plebeians were, which I think does lend itself to the idea that they were, in a sense, guardians of Rome's culture and virtues, in a way.
And explains why you couldn't be a pleb and become a plebeian, become a patrician.
Yeah, exactly, that and the whole lineage thing, yeah. Yes, sorry, Simon, were you going to say something there?
I'm going to ask because this is just, and I'm definitely probably the least informed about Roman in this group. In regards to the patricians, it is like purely hereditary. It's about bloodline.
Yes, that is entirely what it is about. It is about your family being able to be traced back to those Trojan founding fathers. That's, yes, spot on.
So am I right in saying there were some instances of adoptions of particularly competent plebs into the family?
Yes, I was actually just going to get onto that. Believe it or not, I've got facts and everything.
Before you do, what happens when or if a patrician family like completely dies out, or does it not get to that point because they'd adopt a high-ranking plebeian?
I don't know of a specific example of a patrician family being completely wiped out. I assume that it would just be the end of the lineage. Sorry, I don't.
One patrician family.
Yes, yeah. You gotta understand that they've got like these families would have loads and loads and loads of descendants, so it's pretty hard for them to be wiped out completely. Although, yeah, I understand where you're coming from with the idea of like, well, if there's only so many patrician families, surely you could wipe them out, and there goes Rome's link to its founding fathers and even to its gods, essentially.
I'm sure it happened, and I can't really think of an internally sort of rational reason as to why that would, or why that wouldn't happen. You know, why that would just be, or why that wouldn't just be something that, just happened and nobody could really do anything about it if they have like a divine lineage kind of thing going on.
Yeah, it's one of those things I just don't have an answer for, I'm afraid. Yeah.
The odds that someone would have fudged their lineage anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, do you any more questions on that before I move on to the next point?
Yeah, I'm not sure how easy it is to answer, but do you know? So in terms of the patrician families themselves, how many were there? Like, because we're not sure if one did get wiped out, is it a case of there's still like 8 or 10 more or more that could do
the people, the patricians, like I said, are linked back to Rome's founding myth. So it is said that the first 100 senators that were appointed by Romulus were the original patricians, and their descendants became the patricians of first the monarchy, then the republic, then the empire. So yeah, it theoretically started with 100 people because the whole Romulus Remus thing is not exactly historically accurate, or at least contentious. Right. Anyway, this is another point that Rupert just brought up. A plebeian could become a patrician through adoption, and in the similar vein, plebs could marry in a patrician, and the children would always be considered to be patricians. That means, but depending on the time periods, and this changes a lot between the monarchy, the republic, and the empire, and then during those periods, different laws are introduced. So this changes a decent amount as time goes on. It's kind of hard to track. Unless you specifically go in and decide you're going to find out what's going on. Sometimes marriage between plebs and patricians is illegal. Sometimes it is legal. It's I remember seeing something. It's your marriage has to be legitimate in order for it to for your children to properly inherit titles and property and the status of patrician. It's a little weird, actually.
Quite similar to the European knights that we were talking about then, as well.
Yeah, similar to that.
Basically, it's the marriage will only be accepted if the family as a whole accepts it to kind of stop, I guess, a diffusion of power, I suppose.
Yeah, I imagine so. Like I said, it changes a lot. Like marriage in the monarchy is under different rules to marriage in the republic, and that has several laws that change throughout its run, and then the empire comes in, and then laws change again. It's
damn you, for lasting so long and having your rules constantly change.
Yeah, better men than I would be able to tell you exactly the differences between each period. But for the most part, yes, a marriage, if it was legal and sort of socially accepted or accepted by the gods or however you want to frame it, you could mix the two classes that way, and their offspring would be patricians.
Well, the idea of it being accepted by the gods has to be a pretty significant component, especially if we're talking about the difference between having a divine bloodline be accepted or not. There must be a spiritual component to the marriage.
Well, there's almost always a spiritual component to marriage, and given that it is a religious institute.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I'm just highlighting the fact.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to get too caught up on the whole marriage thing, seeing as that's more of a footnote of anything.
Yeah.
I don't have the answers to it, I'm afraid.
Alright,
So,
what's next?
Right.
Hold on. So patrician marriage is more between other patrician families then?
Yes, it was typical that plebs would marry plebs and patricians would marry patricians, but a patrician could marry a plebeian depending on the circumstances.
Right.
Okay. Then. Next, I wanted to mention the Equities, sometimes referred to as Roman knights, but I'm not going to be using that term too often because it might confuse people with the European knights we were just speaking of. So the Equities, this was a position that was in between being a patrician and pleb. They were high-ranking cavalrymen in the legions, and yes, sometimes referred to as Roman knights. I think that term was retroactive in comparing them to European knights as well. So, anyway, they were usually individuals who managed to rise through the ranks of the military or had gained social status through other means, typically military, typically through actions on the battlefield that would then get them promoted. They were considered to be the upper echelons of society, but they were not patricians. Just because you became an equity, it meant that you didn't become a patrician. You were merely like a patrician. You didn't have that important lineage to Rome's founding fathers, and you didn't have that extra connection to the gods. I think it's just interesting to note that these high-ranking members of the cavalry ended up becoming more powerful over time, especially during the crisis of the 3rd century, under the reign of Gallienus specifically, because he had reformed the European legions to be more focused on cavalry, and so his cavalry commanders became more powerful. Notably, a few other emperors, Claudius II, Aurelian, and Diocletian, were all cavalry commanders before they became emperors. Oh, and for people who know who Arminius is, he also reached the rank of equity. I think I've said that wrong, and I said it in about 3 different ways. Anyway, does anyone want to speak anything about that before we move on to my last point?
Yeah. So on the Equities points, as I recall, that, well, I mean, like you said, it becomes more of a case of they're favoured more by the emperors as a means of filling out a civil service which will be more loyal to them, rather than relying on people who already have a sort of high station in society. So they're able to raise the Equites in order to be more loyal. And that was one of the methods that they ended up centralising power, I believe.
Yes, as far as I'm aware, I know that especially sorry. I'm just absolute word salad there. I know that Gallienus, having reordered the cavalry in Europe, then had a sort of posse, for lack of a better term, of close commanders who would then become the next few emperors, and even Diocletian, when he was emperor, an ex-cavalry commander. Then when he started the Tetrarchy, all of them were old friends and from the cavalry who were in similarly high-ranked positions. It was sort of just a way of raising people up to be of a higher social standing that you could then rely on to be called up for service or favors or whatever you might need of them.
Yeah, that's a bit of a digression, though. It'd be better if we stayed on the Patricians. If you've got more to add about them.
I do actually have a little bit more to add to the Patricians, assuming Simon and Henry don't have anything to say about the Equities.
No, I felt that was very straightforward.
A fairly quick question, I hope, is that in terms of who the Equites were, was it just all cavalry, or was it like a higher position, like a heavy cavalry, or what sort of position? What, I don't know, I might be going into too much detail about the structure of Roman armies.
From what I know, there wasn't any in the legions. There was each legion had a cavalry element to it, and the cavalry was, or at least the leaders of the cavalry were considered to be some of the most high-ranking members of that legion.
Well, stop me if I'm contradicting what you've read, Kurtz, but as I understood it, the Equites is describing of a kind of social situation first, and a position in the in the armed forces or the army second. So an Equites, or one of the Equites, would typically be a rich pleb, or it's just a higher ranking pleb.
Yeah, it's much of Rome's sort of social structure. It is really closely tied to the military. So a rich pleb becomes an Equites and ends up becoming a high-ranking cavalry member. It's, from what I can, they're sort of one and the same. Your military service and your social standing in civilian life from Rome, especially for the Equites. From what I've read, that your position on the battlefield and your position in society are very closely linked.
Yeah, I think that's a relatively general thing in the sort of ancient and classical world.
Right.
But anyway.
Right, cool. Moving on. The Patricians would... what the Patricians did for a living, or how they spent their time, I suppose. They would often be senators, or would otherwise hold other sort of political or governmental positions, such as the aforementioned consuls or tribunes or dictators. So those was one of the kinds of jobs that they would be known for holding, as well as aforementioned high-ranking military positions like being legates or being in advisory positions to legions. A lot of patricians were wealthy landowners who owned large estates and villas with large amounts of farmland, which could be tended to by their slaves. That gave them what was essentially a passive income, so they could spend their free time pursuing arts, whether that be poetry or painting, living lives of leisure, so to speak, having banquets and sorts. And there was also this idea of patronage in Rome, where typically a patrician, acts as patron to a client who would be of lower social standing to themselves. Sometimes a pleb, sometimes possibly an Equites, or possibly another patrician who's just not as well off or as well-renowned as they are. And so the patron would provide aid to the client This would be things like representing them in court, loaning them money, supporting them if they ran for political positions, and arranging or influencing marriages for them. And in return, the client was expected to aid the patron when he needed it. That would be things like backing his own political ambitions, going to war with him, and other forms of assistance when called upon. And
Very hierarchical and sort of stratified.
Yes, very much so. That's pretty much all I have to say on the patricians. Is there any more points anyone wants to bring up?
Well, okay, so a question. Based on that, what would you say is the kind of primary focus of this sort of aristocracy, the patrician aristocracy? Because it sounds more kind of and based on some of the other things I know, but it sounds a bit more sort of civil, political, legalistic, that kind of thing. What would you say?
I'd agree to that, essentially, that they are essentially putting themselves in the position of leaders. They're more easily set up to become politicians or high-ranking military personnel, or they're owning land. They're influencing art in that way. They've got the system of patronage where they're directly influencing individuals. So, yeah.
Yeah, and they're on the battlefield, but in a less sort of defining way compared to, say, the European knights.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
More likely to end up being a commander or the period's equivalent.
Yeah. And what effect would you say that having this particular kind of aristocracy had on Roman society as a whole? Both genetic and social.
I'll start off with social, just because I think that's easier to answer. In the Republic, it was certainly a cause for a bit of division, because, like I said, there was as time went on, the plebeians became more and more like the patricians in their legal rights, because the Roman Republic sort of had framed itself as being for the people, by the people, in a sense. That's a massive oversimplification, but still. And the plebeians were able to see that, well, it's not entirely fair that if we're all supposed to be the same, only the patricians are allowed to take up certain positions in government or in the military, and that eventually leads to the plebeians going on strike and revolting. Roman politics start to have elements of like violence with political assassinations, politicians and senators being beaten to death in the streets in some extreme cases. That leads to a certain amount of division. But it's from what I see, it's supposed to be this idea that the patricians are guiding the plebs in a sense. They're guiding the society to into what they would perceive to be what is best for it.
Yeah, that comes through in both the spiritual sense and also in the kind of more material sense, where on a day-to-day basis they're exchanging favors and such,
and
have that very reciprocal relationship and constant contact with one another.
Yeah, there was a lot of political intrigue going on, especially because so many patricians are politicians or senators. A lot of there's rivalries between the different families. There's different families are trying to constantly vie for position, making bargains with one another, like a sort of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You make sure I become consul, and I'll make sure that you become consul next year, sort of thing.
Do you know how much they thought about it in terms of dynastic struggle rather than, say, individual achievement?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm aware of this idea that in Rome you're supposed to live up to the achievements of your fathers or your ancestors. That if your father had achieved something great, then you were to at least match him and preferably go beyond that. So there's certainly a sense that links you back in that way.
Yeah, yeah, that definitely shines through in what I've read about people like, in the extreme, Gaius Julius Caesar, but even a little bit before that, the Gracchi.
Yeah.
I'm hogging all of the questions here. Have you guys got any other questions?
I do have a question, but I believe you haven't talked about the genetic effect yet.
Right, the genetic effect. Right, now you see, I had assumed I'd have come up with a better answer while laying out the previous one, but that hasn't happened. I suppose the genetic effect would.
I mean, if you haven't found a genetic effect, it might just be that there wasn't much
I
of it.
genuinely can't think of one. I was thinking now, perhaps this would lead to an inbred aristocracy in the patricians, but I've not read anything about any such things.
Well, they constantly have the option of bringing in new blood, so...
Well, yeah, they can bring in new blood, exactly, so...
And it's a fairly wide pool of families, so I don't think...
Yeah, I appreciate the idea that when you speak of a certain number of families being like, oh, these are the only people who can hold certain positions in office or whatever, it probably brings to mind like, oh man, there's probably only like 8 or 9 big families, but there's many.
Okay.
Well, I guess in terms of what kind of temperaments it would encourage, then that might be something to consider, because obviously, so there's the idea that you would have these two categories getting more genetically distinct over time. I would assume, all of the things being equal between the patricians and the plebs, because they are keeping themselves deliberately sort of genetically isolated in a certain sense. But then there's also the traits that are being selected for in the patrician class. So what do you think that would entail?
I suppose what the patricians are selecting for this.
I guess that's a question open to the floor. Like, what do you
Yeah,
think?
what are the patricians selecting for, as opposed to what? Well, I guess the plebs aren't selecting for anything. They're just going about normally. There's no restrictions on marriage in that sense.
Well, in terms of the plebs, it might be something like the ability to work in something resembling a market economy, because that would just be a matter of, how much money can you get as a pleb, and that would be what would reward you with better, mating prospects.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I think it's really hard to say, because there's, like, quite a meritocratic element going on there with the idea of adopting non-patricians into the family and all that.
Yeah. Maybe it would encourage a kind of respect towards sacrality, the sacrality of the system, both because they'd have a vested interest in it, and also because they're sort of, I guess, brought in this atmosphere of respect for tradition and being, spiritually distinct. And I don't know, would that matter?
I will say in that vein, I'm not sure how related this is to genetics exactly, but for the consuls, for example, being a consul made you sort of sacrosanct in the sense that that to do harm to a consul wasn't just a crime in that you were attacking another person. It was against the gods to do such a thing.
Yeah. Oh, actually, that's the point. As I recall, it was seen as very dishonourable to be involved in kind of commercial and market activities. So you'd probably have, in that vein, a selector against the kind of money-making schemes that otherwise would be selected for in both the modern day and also probably among the plebs, rather.
And the anti-entrepreneurial spirit.
Something like that, yeah.
Well, the thing that I suppose the thing that leaps out to me is the patron system, because it sort of enforces this investment back into the community and has a spirit of, because their main way of gaining political power, unless I'm understanding it wrong, was through giving favors to people and then getting the favors, the services back from them.
Yes.
Just tying them more closely into the community that they serve or the rule over, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I've just thought that considering one of their main professions, well, two of their main professions both involve, so both acting as a kind of lawyer, solicitor type person, legal expert basically, and also a senator or a general sort of politician / rhetorician, they would both encourage a very kind of verbal intelligence kind of aptitude. That's what would be one of the main things that would be selected for, because that's what that's the meritocratic system that they're working within. So you'd be generating a lot of people who have a high verbal intelligence. Do you think?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay. I have one potentially quick, potentially very long question, but I'll leave it up to you to decide how much detail you're going to go into it. But basically, so when we were talking about the emperors, I believe you said it was in the crisis of the 3rd century, the emperors coming from the Equities class rather than coming from the Patrician class. Is that the norm, or is it depend on the time period, or what was going on basically?
The crisis of the 3rd century is a weird time period where Rome is really just churning through emperors at an alarming rate. And the thing with the cavalry commanders frequently, or emperors being pulled from the group of cavalry commanders, was simply that at that time the cavalry was the most important military asset Rome had, especially in Europe, well, particularly in Europe. And there's a certain nepotism to the emperors in ancient Rome that you don't necessarily need to make. If you are emperor and you are selecting your heir, you don't necessarily need to make your biological son emperor. You can adopt somebody else and claim them to be your heir. So what's happening in the crisis of the 3rd century is emperors are dying really quickly and dying relatively young. So on their deathbeds, they know that they've got a cavalry commander who they're close to, someone else that they know from their military, and they're like, he'll do a good job in my stead, and I can trust him because he's my friend. That's what's happening in the crisis of the 3rd century.
But so normally, would they come from the patrician class, or is it just a fairly broad sort of spectrum?
I spent some time looking into this. I saw something that said that the emperor was supposed to be a patrician, but
definitely in the early days they were.
Yes, exactly, but I'm not sure if it was upheld. I was looking for specific examples of plebeian emperors. I was struggling to find something that was concrete. But I suppose it would be expected, or the original intention was for the emperor to always be a patrician, going off how in the early days of the Republic it was expected that consuls and dictators would always be patricians. I don't think it's far-fetched to say that you would assume your emperor would always be a patrician.
I mean, given the relative weight they've put on to the whole idea of because I feel like it's what they've made relatively important is that connection between this hereditary connection to their founders. So it makes sense that you'd want a emperor to have the same qualities, just because then you know that he will be a guardian for your culture, rather than try to change it to suit his ends.
Yeah.
Right. Are we happy with what we've discussed about the patricians of Rome then?
Seems that way. I don't have any more questions.
Right. Excellent. I believe we'll move on to one of you guys next.
Yeah,
Simon.
move on to the next one.